What would you do if your HOA suddenly decided your property wasn't really yours? If they twisted the rules, blindsided you with fines, and made your life a living nightmare, all because one person didn't like what you were doing? That's exactly what happened to me when I decided to renovate my grandparents' old ranch house in Oakwood Estates. I'm Ethan Carter, an architectural engineer, and I pride myself on doing things by the book. When I inherited the house last year, I knew it needed serious work. The kitchen had avocado green appliances, the walls were covered in dark wood paneling, and the whole place felt like it had been trapped in the 1970s. I wasn't just updating it for aesthetics, I was making it more energy efficient, adding value to the neighborhood. And I did everything right. I read every HOA bylaw, submitted my renovation plans, got approval from the board, and secured all necessary permits from the city. So, when the contractors arrived early Monday morning to start demolition, I thought we were in the clear. That illusion lasted exactly 2 minutes. At 7:32 a.m., a sharp knock at my front door signaled my first encounter with Pam Thornton, the self-proclaimed enforcer of Oakwood Estates. She stood there, a woman in her mid-50s with impeccably highlighted blonde hair cut into a rigid, no-nonsense bob. Dressed in expensive athleisure, holding a giant insulated coffee mug with, "Because I said so," printed on the side, she exuded the kind of authority only someone who thrives on making other people miserable could possess. "Excuse me," she said, skipping introductions altogether. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Her voice carried that signature HOA tone, falsely sweet but laced with the unmistakable implication that I was already guilty of something. I smiled, extending a hand. "Good morning, I'm Ethan Carter. I moved in a few months ago. We're starting some approved renovations today." Pam didn't take my hand. She didn't even glance at it. Instead, she narrowed her eyes. "I don't recall any approved renovations for this property," she said slowly, like a teacher catching a student cheating on a test. "As the HOA compliance director, I review all submissions, and I certainly would remember this." I had been warned about Pam Thornton. Every neighborhood has a Pam, the person who thinks their title gives them unlimited power, the type who thrives on conflict and rules that only apply when she decides they do. Calmly, I retrieved my approval documents and handed them to her. "Everything's in order. Signed by Rick Montgomery, HOA president, and the rest of the board." I tapped the highlighted section. "It looks like you were on vacation the week they voted." For the first time, Pam's composure cracked. Her jaw tightened as her face turned an impressive shade of red. "These approvals," she hissed, "are preliminary at best. Final decisions require my review. Stop all work immediately until I've had a chance to properly evaluate your plans." I held my ground. "I'm sorry, but the work is scheduled and fully approved. If you have concerns, I suggest bringing them up at the next HOA meeting. But for now, we're proceeding as planned." Pam's eyes darkened, and her lips curled into a tight smile. "We'll see about that," she said, whipping out her phone and walking away without another word. 45 minutes later, Rick Montgomery, our mild-mannered HOA president, showed up at my door. He looked uncomfortable, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure he hadn't been followed. And when I saw Pam standing behind him, arms crossed, smirking, I knew she had already set something in motion. I barely had time to process the confrontation with Pam before the next wave of trouble arrived. Rick Montgomery, the HOA president, stood on my porch looking like a man who would rather be anywhere else. Behind him, Pam loomed, arms crossed, an all-too-satisfied smirk playing at her lips. "Ethan," Rick started, shifting uncomfortably. "We, have a bit of a situation." "Do we?" I asked, already tired of the game. "Because as far as I know, I followed every rule, got approval, and have permits. What's the problem now?" Pam stepped forward, cutting Rick off. "As I was saying earlier, the HOA reserves the right to reevaluate projects if concerns are raised. After reviewing your plans, I have significant concerns." Rick sighed. "Pam has," he hesitated, clearly debating whether to continue, "raised complaints about potential violations." I kept my voice level. "What violations?" Pam's smirk widened. "That remains to be determined." Before I could respond, a loud rumble interrupted us, the sound of a police car pulling up in front of my house. Then another. Within moments, 2 uniformed officers stepped out, scanning the construction site with wary expressions. Pam clasped her hands together like a queen surveying her subjects. "That's him," she called out dramatically, pointing at me. "That's the one performing unauthorized construction and causing a public disturbance." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. I walked toward the officers, hands casually at my sides. "Good morning, officers. I'm Ethan Carter, the homeowner. What seems to be the issue?" The older officer, whose nameplate read Rodriguez, flipped through a notepad. "We received a report about unpermitted construction, excessive noise, and blocked sidewalk access." I pulled out my phone and, within seconds, had my digital copies of permits and HOA approvals in front of them. Officer Rodriguez examined the documents and nodded. "Everything looks in order, Mr. Carter. And the noise levels are well within the legal limits for construction hours." Pam huffed, stepping forward. "Check again. They're disturbing the peace. And those trucks," she gestured wildly, "are obstructing pedestrian access." The younger officer glanced at the vehicles. "They're parked in the driveway, ma'am. Not blocking the sidewalk." Pam's face twitched. "Well," she snapped, "I think you should measure the noise levels." Rodriguez let out a slow breath, clearly done with the situation. "Ma'am, making false reports to the police is a serious offense. I'd advise against calling 911 for non-emergency situations in the future." Pam's face turned blotchy with rage, but she held her tongue as the officers left. I thought that would be the end of it. I should have known better. The next morning, I woke up to a bright orange stop work notice taped to my front door. It looked official at first glance, stamped with the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association logo. The document listed 12 violations, including unauthorized use of non-conforming materials and failure to maintain neighborhood aesthetic standards. At the bottom, in bold letters, it stated I would be fined $200 per day until work ceased. And, of course, it was signed by Pam Thornton, HOA Enforcement Officer. I let out a slow, controlled breath before dialing Rick Montgomery. "Let me guess," I said the second he picked up, "Pam's new trick?" Rick groaned. "Ethan, I just saw it myself. She has no authority to issue stop work orders or fines. She's overstepping, and she knows it. So what now?" "I'll talk to the board," he said. "In the meantime, keep working." I barely had time to relay this to my contractors before another vehicle pulled up. This time, it wasn't a police car. It was a city code enforcement vehicle. A tired-looking inspector stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Morning," he said, rubbing his temple. "Name's Frank Delaney. Got a call about unpermitted work and potential safety violations." I was beyond exhausted at this point but still managed a polite smile. "Of course you did. I have my permits right here." Delaney scanned them, flipping through his reference sheets. "Well, these look in order," he admitted. "Complaints mentioned something about structural modifications not covered under your permits." "We haven't even done any structural work yet," I pointed out. He frowned, then glanced toward my porch. "Mind if I take a look?" I gestured for him to go ahead. Delaney did a thorough walkthrough, checking everything from debris disposal to window replacements. When he was done, he shook his head. "I don't see any violations," he said. This was a waste of time. Before I could respond, Pam appeared in my open doorway. "Excuse me, she interrupted, stepping forward like she owned the place. Are you from code enforcement? I've documented numerous violations you should be aware of. Delaney turned to her with the look of a man who had dealt with one too many Pams in his lifetime. Ma'am, I've reviewed the permits and inspected the work. Everything is in compliance. Pam's jaw clenched. But no violations, Delaney said firmly. I suggest you take it up with the HOA board if you have concerns. But legally, this work is authorized. Pam's lips pressed into a thin line. She glared at me, then at Delaney, then stormed off without another word. By that afternoon, my renovation had become the neighborhood spectacle. Cars slowed as they passed, their occupants craning their necks to see what all the fuss was about. A few neighbors even stopped by to introduce themselves, quietly sharing their own Pam horror stories. Apparently, I wasn't the first person she had tried to bully into submission. The realization sent a slow-burning anger through me. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about every homeowner in Oakwood Estates who had ever been harassed, fined, or sabotaged by a woman who had twisted HOA rules into her personal weapons. And I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever, ***. By the next morning, Pam Thornton had escalated from a neighborhood nuisance to a full-fledged war general. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee when my contractors called. Pam's SUV was blocking my driveway. I stepped outside and sure enough, her oversized luxury SUV was strategically positioned just enough to make unloading equipment a nightmare. The smug satisfaction in her parking job was almost artistic, just close enough to inconvenience me, but not enough for immediate towing. I sighed and pulled out my phone, dialing the non-emergency police line. Yeah, I told the dispatcher. I've got a neighbor blocking access to my driveway and interfering with a permitted construction project. She's been warned before. Can you send an officer? 20 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up, and I didn't even have to explain. The officer recognized Pam immediately. I watched from my porch as he approached her, leaning against the driver's side window. Pam gestured dramatically, undoubtedly spinning a tale of how she was being persecuted for protecting the neighborhood. A moment later, the officer stepped back and gestured to the curb. Pam's lips pursed, her face an alarming shade of red. With exaggerated reluctance, she threw her SUV into reverse, slamming the gas like a petulant teenager. As she sped off, she shot me a glare that could have melted glass. But the battle was far from over. By mid-morning, a small group of Pam's allies had gathered across the street, sipping coffee and making a public show of monitoring my renovation. One woman in yoga pants took dozens of photos of the worksite, while another elderly man audibly muttered about bringing back neighborhood standards. Then one of them, a woman I later learned was Pam's closest ally, Marjorie, approached my lead contractor, arms crossed. "We need to see your credentials," she demanded, as if she were an official inspector. "Are you even licensed to work in this state?" My contractor, a no-nonsense guy named Dave, barely looked up from his clipboard. "Lady, I've been licensed longer than you've been sticking your nose where it don't belong." She gasped in outrage. "That is incredibly rude." "So's harassing a man while he's doing his job," Dave muttered, before turning his back to her. Marjorie huffed and stormed off, but she and the rest of Pam's squad continued lurking, snapping photos, and whispering. Then came the emergency HOA meeting. That evening, Rick Montgomery called to warn me. "Pam is claiming you misrepresented aspects of your renovation. She's calling for a revote on your approval." I nearly laughed. "Are you kidding me?" "Wish I was," he admitted. "But she's got a slideshow and everything." I showed up to the packed HOA meeting that night, fully expecting a circus. I wasn't disappointed. Pam had somehow prepared a meticulously curated slideshow filled with selectively edited photographs, all manipulated to make my renovation look disastrous, close-up shots of construction debris, temporary fencing that she tried to frame as permanent obstructions, and shadowy angles that made my house appear larger and more imposing than it actually was. Then she went in for the kill. "I have undeniable proof that Mr. Carter is violating our agreed-upon renovation plans," she announced dramatically, clicking to a new slide. A zoomed-in image of the window installation. She turned to the room. "The approved plan specifies Anderson windows, but look closely. The workers are installing Pella windows." She folded her arms, triumphant. "That is a blatant violation of the application he submitted." For a moment, the room was silent. I looked at the screen, then back at Pam. I exhaled slowly, then walked to the front of the room, clicking a remote to bring up my own side-by-side comparison slides. "First of all," I said, keeping my tone measured, "the HOA approved the design specifications. Nowhere in the bylaws does it state that specific brands must be used. The Pella windows match the exact size, material, and style of the Anderson models originally listed. This is standard in construction. Substitutions happen when supply chain issues arise or better options are available. The quality remains equal or superior." I clicked to the next slide, ****, a printout of the HOA bylaws, highlighting the absence of any language regarding mandatory brand adherence, ****. The tension in the room shifted. Several board members frowned at their notes. Some neighbors nodded, murmuring among themselves. Then, Linda Harrington, the retired attorney on the board, leaned forward. "Pam," she said in a measured tone, "as a real estate agent, you should know that brand substitutions within approved specifications are industry standard unless you can point to a specific bylaw that has been violated. This is a non-issue." Pam's face twitched. "Well, do you have anything else?" Linda interrupted, cutting through the nonsense. Silence. The vote was 4-2 in favor of dismissing Pam's concerns. Only Pam and Marjorie voted against me. Defeated, Pam slammed her laptop shut. But before she stormed out, I saw her in an intense whispered conversation with an older man near the back of the room. I leaned over to Rick. "Who's that?" Rick kept his voice low. ****, Greg Simmons. Regional manager of her real estate firm ****. My stomach clenched. Pam wasn't just waging a personal war, there was something bigger at play. Later that night, I got a message from a neighbor. A rumor was spreading that the State Real Estate Commission had been contacted about Pam's ethically questionable behavior. If Pam was feeling the heat, she wasn't showing it, not yet, but for the first time since this battle started, I saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Worry. The morning after the HOA meeting, I woke up expecting things to be calmer. After all, Pam had suffered a very public loss, and her credibility was slipping fast. But I should have known better. Pam Thornton didn't accept defeat, she escalated. At precisely 8:15 a.m., I received a legal notice taped to my front door. It looked official, printed on letterhead from a well-known local law firm. The document claimed that if I continued my renovation, would be facing a $50,000 lawsuit for damaging neighborhood property values and violating restrictive covenants. I stood there, staring at the letter, feeling the familiar burn of frustration. I knew I hadn't violated anything. This was another tactic to intimidate me. But if Pam thought I would just roll over, she didn't know who she was dealing with. I called the number listed on the letter, expecting to reach an attorney's office. Instead, I got a voicemail that didn't even list a firm name. That set off alarm bells. I contacted a friend who worked in real estate law, forwarding him a copy of the letter. An hour later, I got a text back. That law firm doesn't exist. Pam had completely fabricated the lawsuit. I took the letter straight to City Attorney Jessica Langford, who had already been investigating Pam for harassment. She took one look at the document, her expression shifting from curiosity to sharp irritation. "This," she said, holding it up, "is fraud." Pam had crossed into criminal territory. As I left City Hall, I saw my neighbor Tyler Rhodes jogging down the sidewalk. He slowed when he spotted me, glancing toward my house. "Man," he said, shaking his head, "you're really in the thick of it with Pam, huh?" "That's putting it mildly." Tyler hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Listen, I wasn't gonna say anything, but you should probably know, Pam tried to get your house sold before you even started renovations." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He glanced around, then took a step closer. "A few months ago, Pam was trying to line up an investor to buy your house cheap. She told them she could make sure your renovation didn't happen. The deal fell through when you didn't back down." I stared at him. "You're telling me all of this, the complaints, the HOA meetings, the fake lawsuit, was about money?" Tyler nodded. "She wasn't trying to protect neighborhood values. She wanted to flip your house." And suddenly, everything made sense. Pam didn't just hate my renovation, she had a financial motive to sabotage it. That night, I sent everything I had, the fake legal letter, the harassment claims, and now, a documented motive, to the State Real Estate Commission. If Pam thought she could manipulate HOA rules for personal gain, she was about to face real consequences. By the next morning, the fallout had begun. Pam's real estate firm issued her an ultimatum: step back from HOA activities or find another brokerage. The ethics inquiry from the State Commission was a serious black mark on her career, and her bosses wanted no part of the mess she had created. That afternoon, Rick Montgomery showed up at my door, looking both amused and relieved. "Got some news," he said. Pam resigned from the HOA board and the Architectural Review Committee. Effective immediately. I let out a slow breath. She actually quit? She had to. Her firm forced her hand. Between that and the city attorney breathing down her neck, she's in damage control mode. I nodded, letting the information settle. The war was over. Pam Thornton was out. The days following Pam's resignation felt almost surreal. For the first time since my renovation started, my house was just a construction site again, not a battleground. No more surprise inspections. No more bogus complaints. No more tense HOA meetings designed to trip me up. My contractors worked without interruption, and what was supposed to be a 2-month project that had stretched into nearly 4 finally neared completion. Without Pam's interference, the transformation was faster than I expected. The once outdated rancher now stood as a modern, energy-efficient home that blended seamlessly into the neighborhood while enhancing its character. The irony? The very thing Pam claimed would ruin property values ended up increasing them. Even the few neighbors who had sided with her began to change their tune, some even asking for my contractor's contact information for their own renovations. Then came the final, poetic twist. A real estate listing went up for Pam's house. The sign appeared on her front lawn one morning, and within days, the online listing followed. But the best part? Her property photos prominently featured my beautifully renovated home in the background, the same home she had fought so hard to sabotage. According to neighborhood gossip, Pam's departure wasn't voluntary. Between the ethics inquiry from the State Real Estate Commission and pressure from her brokerage, she had no choice but to leave Oakwood Estates. She had spent years controlling the HOA, dictating which plants people could have in their yards, what shades of paint were acceptable, and whether renovations were appropriate. Now, she was gone. At the next HOA meeting, with Pam out of the picture, the board voted in favor of new architectural guidelines, ones that encouraged thoughtful modernization while maintaining neighborhood charm. My project had set a precedent, proving that change didn't have to be the enemy. The young couple, Tyler and Emily Rhodes, who had admired my renovation, soon closed on a house down the street, eager to start their own updates, this time under a far more reasonable set of rules. And as for Pam? Last I heard, she had moved into a downtown condo, where she immediately joined the social committee. Apparently, she was now embroiled in a new battle over holiday decorations and acceptable doormat sizes. Some battles never end, they just move to a new location. But for me? I had one. Not just my renovation, but the right to stand my ground. And sometimes, that's all it takes to spark change. Have you ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, or a Pam of your own? Share your story below, let's see who had it worse.